Hello everybody, Ellie here for WhoCulture. And after season 1 has now aired, there are now enough clues, enough little snippets about Mrs. Flood that we can now start to form some theories about who she might be. And according to Anita Dobson herself, we are going to get some answers in season 2. So, who is she? Probably the most logical explanation for who Mrs. Flood is that she is another god. So Russell T Davies has obviously built this whole entire era of the show around gods, around this pantheon of gods. And in general, there's kind of been this big shift towards the supernatural this season. I mean, Kate literally says that things are starting to become more supernatural. And to be honest, I don't see any reason why this won't continue going forward into season 2 and beyond. Now, when you think about it as well, Mrs. Flood seemed to be aware of Sutek in The Legend of Ruby Sunday. I mean, she literally says, "He waits no more." Just like the toy maker was also aware of him in The Giggle when he said that he ran from the one who waits.
I saw it, hiding, and I ran.
If that's the case, then it kind of seems like gods are aware of other gods. So the fact that Mrs. Flood was aware of Sutek suggests that she is also a god. And of course, in The Legend of Ruby Sunday, Harriet Arbinger name-dropped a whole ton of different gods. She had the toy maker, obviously, and the trickster, who we are aware of, Maestro, Mara, the reprobate. I mean, it's not exactly subtle, but it is clear that this is going to be the big thing in 15's era, like the cracks in time were for 11. So if this is the case, we then have to determine, what is Mrs. Flood the god of? Now, we have a theory that she might be the god of fiction or the god of stories. Someone with a wider, kind of more meta view of the Whoniverse, if you like, who can kind of see the bigger picture and knows what's going to happen. So at the end of Empire of Death, we see that she's basically narrating the episode to the audience, breaking the fourth wall. And she tells us that the story of the church on Ruby Road is over and that the Doctor's story ends in terror, which is very ominous. I mean, I think that really is our first clue right there. She's a narrator, she's a storyteller, and she can even see how the Doctor's book will end, how the Doctor's story will end, so to speak. And as I just mentioned, we of course have the fourth wall breaking, which she first did in the church on Ruby Road and again did here at the end of Empire of Death. Now, the power to break the fourth wall very much seems like the sort of thing that the god of storytelling would be able to do. You know, someone with the power over narrative, with the power over the events that are occurring. And let's not forget that it was actually Mrs. Flood who directed Ruby to enter the TARDIS in the church on Ruby Road. So maybe she's the one that's been shaping this story all along, influencing the story, almost writing the story. So then earlier in season 1, in the episode 73 Yards, when Ruby and Carla are trying to deal with the woman who is 73 yards away, and Mrs. Flood literally says, "It's nothing to do with me." It was a funny line, and at face value, it's you know, a busybody neighbour kind of going, "Nope, don't be a busybody, don't judge, nothing to do with you, walk away." But it also did feel a little bit strange. Why would an ordinary neighbour not inquire further? I mean, I maybe just answered my own question. Maybe she kind of went, "I don't need to be a busybody," but most people would be like, "What are you doing?" But what if she is the god of stories, she knows how this story is going to play out? It's nothing to do with her, and she knows how it's going to end, and she's not going to interfere because she knows that this story needs to play out the way it does. Does that make sense? Now, one of my favourite clues is the fact that Mrs. Flood seems to have taken some fashion cues from the Doctor's past companions. So obviously there's the outfit she wears in The Legend of Ruby Sunday, which very much looks like Clara's main outfit from Series 9. And then of course there's the more obvious one at the end of Empire of Death, which looks very, very similar to something worn by Romana 1 in the Reboss operation. And then you've also got, at one point she's wearing a beanie like Ryan did. She's also wearing this body warmer very similar to one that Rory has worn. Lots of similarities between costumes worn by Mrs. Flood and past companions of the Doctor. Also, just going back to Clara for a second, when Mrs. Flood comes back to life in Empire of Death, she de-dusts, she calls the Doctor a clever boy. Now obviously this is something that Clara often did, you know, the whole "run you clever boy and remember me." She called him a clever boy quite a lot. Is this a coincidence? I don't know. It feels like it's too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. Then there's also the fact that Mrs. Flood's front door is TARDIS blue, and then all those stickers that were on her suitcase. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about in terms of the stickers, go check out part 1 of our Easter egg breakdown for Empire of Death, and we'll break those down in more detail. But a lot of those stickers relate to places that are associated to the Doctor, like Gallifrey and Beryllium. Now maybe just one or two of these connections could be chalked up to a coincidence, but that Romana outfit is definitely too specific to not be done intentionally. Basically, you have all of these references to the Doctor's life through history. Now, the God of Stories would be able to see the Doctor's life and pick up on these references to showcase to the audience at home. And again, that fits with the fourth wall breaking that we have from Mrs. Flood as well. Now, the other thing I can really see Russell T Davies doing is linking this to the land of fiction somehow. Now, the land of fiction was featured in the 1968 serial The Mind Robber. Basically, it's a realm where stories can become real, where fictional characters become reality, like Rapunzel, for example. Now, maybe this is what Mrs. Flood is referring to in Empire of Death when she literally tells Cherry Sunday that she's going to storm down his gates of gold and seize his kingdom. Now, the land of fiction is referred to as a kingdom in The Mind Robber. Maybe Mrs. Flood actually has big plans that involve dethroning the current master of the land of fiction and then assuming control of all fiction and all stories. Now, if you want to go even more meta with this, Mrs. Flood referring to Cherry's maker could literally be the maker of the character, as in Russell T Davies. Personally, I really hope that this fourth wall breaking doesn't go that far, but if Mrs. Flood is aware that she's in a TV show, then I do wonder how deep this will all end up going. It would certainly be interesting, I will say. I just don't know how they would go about doing that well, without it maybe being a bit cheesy, I'm not sure. But definitely in terms of the land of fiction, I mean, Russell T Davies has literally just plucked the Toymaker and Sutekh from relatively obscure 60s, 70s Doctor Who stories. So we do have to consider the possibility that he would keep doing that. So the land of fiction does feel like it could be a perfect addition when you think about what Russell has been doing so far. Now, there's another possibility about who Mrs. Flood might be, and this lies in the expanded universe. So as we know, these gods are basically one big family. Yeah, so Maestro was the child of the Toymaker, Sutekh was described as the mother and father of them all, and then Harriet mentions that Incenser, the god of disaster, has children called Doubt and Dread. So it's all one big happy family. So if we're rolling with this idea of keeping it in the family, the Toymaker actually has a sister in the expanded universe, Hecuba, the Queen of Time. Now, Hecuba actually was originally intended to appear in the show. The Queen of Time was actually the name of a second Doctor serial that was written by the Toymaker creator Brian Hales. But as is often the case with Doctor Who story ideas, that serial was never made, and then later Big Finish turned the story into an audio adventure in 2013. So Hecuba very nearly was part of the show canon and very much is part of the expanded universe. So she basically has mastery over time, just like Maestro has mastery over music, or the Toymaker has mastery over games. Now, on the surface, the God of Time might not really fit with what we've seen of Mrs. Flood so far, especially with the fourth wall breaking and things. That it feels like there's something else going on. But since time is one of the fundamental laws of the universe, I don't think it's much of a reach to suggest that Mrs. Flood / Hecuba can break those laws to such an extent that she could maybe see outside the universe, outside of time in some way. Also, it is entirely possible that those fourth wall breaks and the more meta moments actually don't mean anything at all, and they're just there as a little bit of fun from Russell T Davies. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that he's offered little to no explanation for certain mysteries. Yeah. Also, let's not forget that there was something funny going on with the clocks in the Season 1 two-part finale. So in The Legend of Ruby Sunday, the clock on the radio in the Sunday's kitchen reads 15:08, 3:08. That's before Carla and Ruby go to unit with the videotape. Then they go to unit, they do all that time window stuff, the Doctor goes to Triad Towers, confronts Susan Triad, and then Sutekh returns. Then, in Empire of Death, the same clock reads 15:33. So what you're telling me is that all of that stuff happened in just 25 minutes? No, it didn't. No, it didn't. Probably take 25 minutes just to get to the Triad Towers, especially with London traffic. I do not believe for a second that all of that happened in 25 minutes. No. Now, Mel also says that Susan Triad is due to make her speech at 3 o'clock. even though that clock already says it's 8 minutes past 3 before Carla and Ruby have even gone back to Unit HQ. This makes no sense. Now, both of these shots of the clock are directly followed by shots of Mrs. Flood. Obviously, the clock is in the Sunday's home as well, which is the house next door to Mrs. Flood's house. Now, okay, fine. Some of this could just be continuity errors. I'll grant you that. I accept it. Fair enough. Maybe nobody thought to check what the time actually said on those clocks when they were filming. Makes sense. However, for two very deliberate close-up shots of the clock, you would think that would be something they would be considering. I mean, if you think about the tiny little hidden details that were spotted in the memory TARDIS or dotted in the background of any Doctor Who episode ever, something as plainly, clearly, obviously meaningful as a close-up of a clock with the time right there on display, I cannot imagine that they didn't think to check what time it was on the clock and cross-reference that with any times mentioned in the script. I just don't believe it. So then going back, if Mrs. Flood is the god of time, does this suggest some sort of time distortion or a manipulation of time in some way that relates back to Mrs. Flood? And then if we link back to what I was saying in the first point, the god of time would be able to see all of time and therefore be able to see all of the Doctor's history. And that then could explain all of the links to companions' costumes, to companions' sayings, and all of those things that I just used as an example to justify my first point. They still work here. I mean, in general, I just feel like the god of time is a really logical god to use in Doctor Who. I mean, it just seems so obvious. It's such an obvious choice for Doctor Who to involve the god of time. I mean, we've had this whole thing about the Doctor being the Lord of Time. Why not give us the god of time? I mean, it's clear that Mrs. Flood almost has this omniscient knowledge and power, and having mastery over all of time would certainly fit within that power. I definitely think that Mrs. Flood is going to turn out to be someone very, very important. I personally think this mystery actually is more intriguing than perhaps the Ruby's mother mystery. I hope that it pays off better than the last mystery did, but I am very excited to go on this journey and learn more about this character. Now, I did briefly mention the memory TARDIS at some point in this video. For the sheer amount of time and effort that went into making that video, if you haven't already, do go and check out our Easter egg video that is solely based on the memory TARDIS, because let me tell you, it was a mammoth task. In the meantime though, I've been Ellie for WhoCulture, and in the words of Riversong herself, goodbye, sweeties.